Hello, everyone. This is Professor Menken. I hope you're adapting well to the new reality of the coronavirus. Today is the first module of the several modules we will examine through the end of this semester. What I suggest you do is either print out the PowerPoint that's posted in Canvas and follow along. Also, get a pen and paper because I'm going to give you some definitions, things you need to take notes of. My plan is for these modules to run somewhere between 10 to 15 minutes each. So you follow along, you'll have my recording on here. I will give you definitions and examples where appropriate. And we're going to split it up. So the first module we're going to talk about is the module on just general assault. So let's start with this. Let's just talk about what is assault and what is, here's some general information on that. Slide number 1. Let's see. Okay, we're not getting the slides to come up. First, okay, what is an assault? That's an attack on a person intended to commit physical harm. It is a violent crime that is most frequently reported to the police. The pattern of assaults fits very well with the patterns of other violent crimes we've seen. So who are most likely to be the victims of assault are young men who are African American. Also, those who are most likely to be arrested for assault are young men who are also African American. So it fits kind of the same pattern as we saw with homicide. And I think probably most importantly on this list, you're most likely to be assaulted by someone you know, whether it is a neighbor, a family member, a friend possibly, an acquaintance generally. So when you think about gang violence and gang assaults, these are people they're not strangers. Members of gangs aren't strangers to one another or to people in rival gangs. They kind of know each other. There's an acquaintanceship there. They're not friends, but there's an acquaintanceship there. So when those kinds of assaults happen, it's usually by people that they're at least associated with. All right, well, let's move on to the next slide. Types of assault. Two basic types we're going to talk about that the law recognizes, and they are here. Simple assault is assault, I'll write this down, that inflicts little or no physical harm. Okay, simple assault inflicts no or little physical harm. So two guys get in a fight in a bar, a couple of blows are exchanged, no weapons are used, that's a simple assault, all right? Some guy comes up behind you, punches you, and takes your purse and runs. That's simple assault, plus aggravated robbery on top of that. But the assault part is still considered simple assault. What makes it different from, the second type, which is a very common form you'll see in those of you interested in the legal profession, is aggravated assault. Aggravated assault, either or, one, it inflicts serious harm. So when we talk about serious harm, usually the victim has to go to the hospital to seek serious medical treatment. So two guys get in a fight in a bar, and one of them beats the crap out of the other one, even though he's not using a weapon. That guy, the person on the floor has to wind up going to the hospital. That can be aggravated assault. Anytime you use a weapon in an assault, whether you inflict a lot of harm or not, you're going to get charged with aggravated assault. So two conditions for aggravated assault. One, serious physical harm, i.e. wind up going to the hospital. Or two, use of a weapon under any circumstances, whether you hurt the person or not. All right. So in 2018, there were 248 assaults for every 100,000 people. That's pretty high. It's not the highest it's ever been, but it is the most frequently reported form of violent crime in the United States. Now, what are some other types of assaults? We're going to kind of go through a couple. One, we're all sort of fascinated as a culture with the concept of mass shootings. So what are mass shootings? A mass shooting, as a definition, is something that happens when at least 4 people are killed in a public setting. Okay, in which the perpetrator, the person who does the shooting, is not known to the victims. Okay, 4 more people are killed in a public setting in which the perpetrator is unknown to the victims. Okay, so an example that would not count as a mass shooting is a disgruntled worker, goes back to the place where he got fired, shoots a bunch of people, and then shoots himself, or the police shoot him. That is not considered a mass shooting by this definition. Now, it can be by other definitions, but what I'm talking about today is the general sort of most feared type of public shooting, a random shooter shooting random people in public spaces. Between 1982 and 2020, there have been 118 of these mass shootings, all but 3 of which were committed by males. So in other words, women don't engage in this kind of activity. The worst we've had in that 18-year time period is in Las Vegas, where 58 people were killed and 500 plus were wounded. Probably the most famous mass shooting actually happened here in Texas, the University of Texas Bell Tower, a guy named Charles Whitman on August 1st, 1966. And this really kind of touched off a culture that became more aware of this type of violence. Who does it? Well, it's mainly white guys. Let's take a chart here. As you can see, the number of mass shootings by race, 64 over the last nearly 20 years have been done by white guys, 20 by black guys, 10 by Latino, 8 by Asians, and then 14 by either unknown race or mixed race or other categories. So again, as you can see here, white guys, in terms of, perpetrating mass shootings of this sport, it's primarily white guys. All right. Second form of abuse we'll talk about is, or assault, is child abuse. Child abuse is a serious problem in the United States. We'll take a look at some of these data here. And the last year for which we have data is 2015. In that year, there were over 700,000 victims of child abuse. 27% of the child abuse reported cases were for victims under the age of 3. It's terrifying to think about. 1 in 4 children are expected to experience some form of child abuse or neglect in their lifetimes. And tragically, about 1,600 children die each year from abuse. Roughly 1,600 died in 2014. Roughly 1,600 died in 2015. Those numbers are very steady over time, which is, again, a terrible situation. 1 in 10 elders, moving on to elder abuse, 1 in 10 elders reported emotional, physical, or sexual abuse. And the thing about elders is that, like children, they're dependent upon their abusers. So most of the abuse of elders comes at the hands of caregivers, either whether it's a family member or someone at a nursing home or an institution. So therefore, the elderly are terrified to report any problems that they're experiencing. Now we're going to move on to a more sensitive topic. Well, not that the others aren't sensitive, but sometimes this topic can be intense for people to deal with, and that is the concept of domestic violence. So I've got the definition of domestic violence on the screen. You can print it out. Basically, what it is, it's a pattern of behavior by one partner over another, and what they're trying to do is maintain power and control in an intimate relationship, right? And they use such methods as, we'll talk about these here in just a few screens, violence, clearly, but also things like sexual assault of domestic partners, social isolation, financial dependence. It really isn't, it's a full spectrum of abuse patterns to basically make someone completely dependent upon them. Okay, so what abusers are trying to do is make the other person completely dependent upon them. That way they have complete and total control over another person's life. Now, let's explore this a little bit. Here are some facts about domestic violence. About 1 out of every 6 couples have at least one physical assault during the year. Half of domestic violence reported, even those that are reported as simple assaults, actually include some serious bodily harm. So in many ways, domestic violence gets understated in the way things are reported. 90% of domestic violence is men on women. And it's also estimated that 85% of actual violence cases go unreported. What are some of the patterns of the abusers? Well, the abusers are, well, first and foremost, abusers can be deniers, all right? So what do we mean by a denier? Well, a denier is someone who um, types, tries to minimize the seriousness of the violence. Oh, it was just an argument that got out of hand. There was no real harm here. She said some things, I said some things, and we're just there was nobody harmed here. It was just an argument that kind of got a little bit out of hand. So they're deniers of any real problem. Secondly, they tend to be objectifiers. People who are abusers are those who see their partner. So, for example, a man and his wife, he sees that wife or girlfriend as their property, or as their sexual objects. They objectify them in that way. Men who abuse tend to have very low self-esteem, and they feel powerless and ineffective in the world, despite the fact that they may be doing very well. They may be very successful, but internally, they see themselves as ineffective, as inadequate, as losers in some way. Okay? And then they take their frustrations about the situation out on their wives or spouses. Jealousy is a high-level trend in domestic abuse. Again, it kind of goes back to low self-esteem. We'll get there in just a second. Number 5, domestic abusers tend to externalize behavior. So what do I mean by externalized behavior? Well, it's when we talked about the construction of blaming in the last section of the course. The denial of a victim. Remember that lecture. They tend to blame their violence on circumstances. So they don't take responsibility for it. They tend to say, well, I have an alcohol problem. I have a drug problem. I was having a really bad day at work. I've been under a lot of stress. Well, my wife's behavior really brought this on. She's not been supporting me. She won't return my phone calls. I don't know. She doesn't communicate well with me in ways, and it always makes me suspicious, and I know she's up to something. So they tend to try to okay, this behavior is I'm just reacting to a bad situation. This is not my fault. This is, the drugs or the alcohol or the wife that won't, do as I say, etc. Those are the real problems there. So they tend to externalize that behavior. And lastly, when people find out about domestic violence in relationships, it's amazing how many people say, wow, I never saw that coming. He was such a pleasant and charming guy. And now he's this guy who has been beating his wife or beating his kids. So many times the abuser can put on a really good front that, oh, I'm just a super nice guy. But when in the confines of their home or in their relationship, they're a completely different person. All right, let's move on to the next slide. So one of the things I also want you to cover is that domestic abuse is not specific really to race or class. It is to genders, mainly men, but in terms of race or class, it happens across all walks of life. So men from rich, poor, white, black, Latino, it doesn't matter. There really aren't any clear patterns there. It happens in many intersections of race and income. Now, what are some red flags that you or someone you know may be in a domestic violent relationship? Number 1 is extreme jealousy. Abusers tend to be highly jealous. They tend to treat women as property. And when people try to take your property, you get jealous about it. They tend to get very jealous of their girlfriends or spouses, oftentimes accusing them of flirting with other guys or, creating or, inappropriate behavior with other men. And they oftentimes can fly into a rage about that. Highly possessive. Okay. Unpredictable mood swings. Like one minute they're fine and the next minute they're raging and rolling about something. Bad temper goes along with that one above. Cruelty to animals. They might kick the dog or kick the cat. Verbal abuse and it usually starts as verbal abuse. Extremely controlling behavior. So what oftentimes most people just think of domestic violence as being a situation where there's a physical aspect to it. So men are beating women, but in reality, the physical aspect may be relatively minor, almost non-existent. But what could be happening is you have what's called social isolation. So sometimes abusers try to cut people off from their friends and family. There's also financial dependence. Again, the abuser is trying to get people dependent upon them. So, they may control the bank account and not give the other person money. They will limit who they can talk to, what friends they can have, what friends they can talk to. So any friend that's going to point out, well, your husband's not treating you well, then the abuser is going to try to cut you off from that relationship. They'll try to isolate you from your family as well, because family will be quick to point out, hey, this is not right. Abusers tend to have antiquated beliefs about women and men in relationships. Oftentimes there can be what's called marital rape or relationship rape, despite the fact that you're in a consensual relationship doesn't mean that, you're a sexual object. I'm not trying to be crude here, but, this is a pattern that shows up in these kinds of relationships. Oftentimes in terms of like getting dependence, some abusers will sabotage birth control in order for the woman to get pregnant, because once she's pregnant and has a child, she's completely dependent upon him. And there's always, again, victim blaming is a very common form of dealing with sexual assault and sexual abuse. The victim is, it wasn't my fault, she brought it on. A couple of other things. So cases of domestic abuse also we'll see where the husband will try to sabotage or destroy the woman's working relationships or her ability to go to school. Again, often the times this is an act of trying to get control, trying to make the woman dependent upon him, and trying to, and with the school thing, it might be a little bit of jealousy. The last thing an abuser wants is an independent, strong woman. He wants a meek, mild, dependent woman. Why? Because she's dependent upon him and that makes him feel important. Again, these are guys that suffer from low self-esteem for the most part. He controls all the finances. I mentioned this one earlier. He's abusive to pets and children. Again, a pattern I mentioned earlier. Oftentimes women who have been the victims will talk about the situation where their husbands were constantly accusing them of inappropriate relationships that didn't happen. Let me see your phone because I want to see who you're texting and talking to. This kind of behavior. These are red flags that you're in a very bad, or someone you know and love is in a very bad relationship. Controlling what the victim wears and how they behave themselves. Demeaning people either in private or especially publicly. Public demeaning is a form of humiliation. And people who have low self-esteem like to humiliate others because for some sick reason it makes them feel better about themselves. Okay, so we're going to stop there. That's the end of this module. It's about 20 minutes long, so watch it as often as you would like. Take some good notes, and the next module we're going to talk about, I'll have posted soon here, but it's going to be on sexual assault. All right, everybody, take care.